Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the new iBasso DX180 digital audio player. This one is in for review by popular demand. So iBasso's been making digital audio players for a long time, but it's been a while since I've taken a look at any of them. But here, the 180, what makes this one interesting is that this is kind of like the latest in around the $500 price point. And in my opinion, the $500 price point is right around where my favorite digital audio players come in. There's definitely cheaper audio players that make some sacrifices. There's more expensive audio players that have a bunch of bells and whistles that I don't really care about. And for me, at around 500 bucks is where I tend to find the audio players that match kind of my balance of features and build quality and all that stuff, and price land. And here we've got the DX180, their latest. This guy does a couple of things that other audio players don't do, and I wish more people did. And I want to talk about those things today, but we got to talk about other stuff as well. So we'll talk about the physical form factor, what comes inside the box. We'll talk about the functionality, the software, what this thing sounds like. I know everyone wants to hear that. And eventually I will give this thing a score, but fair warning, my DAP reviews end up being a little bit on the long side. So buckle up, grab a snack, and let's talk about the DX180. So price-wise on this thing, again, I mentioned it's around 500 bucks. I've seen the price a little bit higher, like 550, and also around 500 bucks, depending on where you're shopping for it. But what you get inside the box is, well, here's the box itself, nice, simple, small box. And this is what you get inside of it, which is pretty standard collection of accessories, including, well, this is not super standard. You get 4 screen protectors, which is a little excessive, but I guess if you scratch them, you'll want to replace them. And it's nice that you've got that option. Now, they are all plastic screen protectors, which I'm personally not a big fan of. I don't use these. And I've never actually really had concerns with scratching on my digital audio players. But if you know you're the sort of person that might scratch a screen, you're throwing these things into a bag with other stuff often, it's nice to have that option. You've also got a charging cable, which I guess you could probably also use for data transfer if you're using a Windows device. I'm a Mac user, and Android to Mac data transfer is a pain in the butt. I don't know if that ever works, but you get a cable here, USB-A to USB-C. There's no charging brick, so you have to provide your own charging brick, but that is pretty standard. And then the other thing that you get in here, which is nice that they include, is a case for your digital audio player. Now, do I want to talk about this now, or do I want to talk about this later? I think I want to talk about this later. This case has both some good things and some problems. The good stuff is it's your pretty typical TPU case. You can feel the buttons, they're nice and protruded, very easy to feel around. And then it leaves room over here for your volume knob. We'll talk about the problem with this case though, and why it's nice that they include a case. I think that they need to make some changes either to the case or the audio player in order for it to work out well. But that will lead us into talking about the physical form factor of this device itself. And this is where we're going to get into talking about some things that other audio players don't do that I really wish they should. But let's start by just taking a look at the build quality of the materials, which is really, really quite nice. In fact, this has some things about the build quality that feel much more high-end than a $500 audio player. I mean, you've got your standard aluminum rails all the way around the outside. You've got a big glass front. You've got a glass back as well. That you can get in other audio players for this price. What's interesting is they've got some unique like chamfering here on the aluminum. I don't know if you can tell. They've got these interesting rails that I think add a nice bit of visual appeal to the DX180, but they also do come with the expense of making this kind of uncomfortable hold. It's not as sharp as something like the Stellan Kern. Was it the SE2000? It's been a while since I even reviewed that, but that guy was like literally uncomfortable to hold. This thing, you can feel the edges, but it's not to the point that I'm really complaining about it. Although here I am doing a review where I'm kind of complaining about it, but just to say, you will feel these things. They are a little bit sharp to the touch, but it didn't really get in the way of me using this device. I think for the trade-off of making this thing look kind of cool and unique, I'll take it. The screen is gorgeous. It is a 1080p screen. And in fact, this is probably the best looking screen I've seen on a $500 player. It just fantastic colors, excellent viewing angles. It looks glossy, very contrasty. This is just a very nice looking screen. In fact, let me scroll it for you. Oh wait, that's a very short list. Let me give you a bigger list to scroll to see that this thing scrolls quite nicely, although maybe a little bit slow to read my memory card. But yeah, just a fantastic screen, a great way to look at my albums. Really love to see it. So that's nice. The other thing that's kind of cool, and this is one of the first things I'm gonna shout out iBasso for doing that other companies don't really do, is offer this player in really handsome colors. All right, so it comes in black. You can get it in black if you want, but it also comes in this color, which I believe is their green. They've got another color that is blue. This is kind of a bluish green, so I'm actually not certain which color I've got, but I think this is the green one. And they're just nice, kind of muted colors. Maybe there's one other company doing it like this. Sony does colors that are very, very similar. I think Sony's players look really handsome, and I think the iBasso DX180 looks really handsome. Again, this is clearly, in my opinion, the best, most attractive looking $500 player, partly because of the things they've done with the aluminum sculpting, the materials, the screen, the color. It's just a really handsome device. Here's the first thing I want to talk about though, that nobody else does, that more companies need to be doing. You see those? Those are screws that are intentionally made so that you can remove the back of the iBasso DX180 to access the internals. Now, everyday life, you should not be accessing the internals of your digital audio player, but there is one important reason you might want to, and that's to replace the battery. So this is a picture I took of this DX180 just yesterday as I took it apart. As you can see, very easy access to the battery there. It's got a standard little pull connector here, so you're not even gonna need to like desolder anything to remove it. Although it did feel like this thing is like glued in place, so you'll probably have to break some adhesive if you need to replace the cable or the battery. But it's nice that you're able to replace the battery, because most of these audio players don't have that option. In fact, most phones don't have that option. Most things just don't. And for a digital audio player that you're going to charge every other day, you know, usually lithium ion batteries have an estimated life of like 500 to 1,000 charges. Let's go with 1,000 charges, so that's an easier number. Let's say you charge this thing every other day. 1,000 charges would give you, let's see, every year you'd be charging it, let's say 175 times. So out of 1,000 charges, you're going to get, you know, between 5 to 8 years of battery life out of this battery before it's degraded to the point that you probably want to replace it. So that's still kind of a long time. But depending on how you use this thing, maybe you're going to actually end up charging it more than once every other day. That's just how often I charge it. So it's nice to have that option to replace the battery. Okay, so that's one of the things I'm really appreciative of them doing, unique and different than other people. Let's go around here to the side now and talk about the buttons, because most of this stuff is stuff that other companies do. This is the standard 3-way buttons. You've got play, pause, you've got previous track, you've got next track. In fact, I think the functionality of previous track versus next track is an option in the controls, and by default it was this was next track and that was previous track. So you can switch it whichever way you want. But it's, you know, the buttons are all the same, which I sometimes complain about buttons being hard to differentiate, right? Because this is, for me, the most important part of having a digital audio player is having good buttons. I want physical buttons that mean I can use the device without having to look at it, without having to turn on the screen. And if all the buttons feel the same, sometimes it can be difficult to figure out and kind of orient myself around it without looking at it. But these I have no problem with. I think partly it's basically just because it's just 3 buttons. And when I have my finger here, I can clearly feel that there's a button below me, so I know that I'm on the middle button. If I'm up here, I can feel that there's not a button above me, so I know I'm on the top button, and vice versa with this guy, right? So yeah, generally very nice button configuration. Then of course you've got a volume knob, which is, you know, not unheard of on a digital audio player. There are a number of audio players out there that have volume knobs, but this one I think is probably the best volume knob I've tried on a DAP. It's just got a really nice action, a nice damped click to it. It is a digital control. As you can see, it's controlling what the volume reading on the screen. It's not just like an analog pot or anything like that. And because of that, it will spin indefinitely, right? So I can go to 0 and keep scrolling, and same for going to the top. I can get to max volume and keep scrolling. That's just because it's a digital clicker instead of the analog clicker. It does have also a power button double functionality, right? So you click in on it to turn the screen on and off. And this is a big point. A lot of these DAPs that have a knob that has a combo power button functionality, I actually have the problem where if I'm scrolling the wheel, I'll accidentally click it and turn the screen on and off, which I don't want, obviously. This one, I don't have that problem at all. They've done a really good job at balancing sort of the force required to spin the wheel, right? You don't want it to be too sensitive, yeah, because you don't want it to like accidentally trigger volume changes when you put the thing in and out of your pocket. But you also don't want it to be so difficult to spin that in the act of spinning it, you end up turning on the screen. And I think that they've really just kind of nailed the balance perfectly here on the iBasso DX180. Really quite dig about it. Now, that said, it is still easy to, well, it's still easier to change the volume accidentally with a knob, even a knob as good as this one, versus your standard audio player that just has push button controls. But that part's not really that surprising. I think, again, they've done a good job here. The balance is good. What's more surprising, however, is that these buttons are, I found, just a little bit too sensitive. It was easy to inadvertently trigger these things when I'm just handling the device. In fact, before starting this review, I picked up the DX180 to set up, and the battery was almost dead because I inadvertently hit play the last time I put this thing down, and it drained the battery. Because these buttons are just a little bit too sensitive, and it just means sometimes you're going to get inadvertent presses. Now, most of the time, it's actually not a problem for me. Okay, I know I'm kind of making a big deal about it right now, but it's most of the time not a big problem for me. When it is a problem for me is when I'm using this case. Okay, and I did have this case on it, which is why that happened. So I mentioned this thing, the case covers up the buttons, and the buttons are a little bit more sensitive to touch than typical. The result is that a lot of times when I'm using this device with the case on, if I press one of these buttons, it triggers another button as well. To the point that sometimes it just feels like it's not responsive. It took me a while to figure out what was going on. I was like, it's not responding to my commands, or it's doing the opposite of what I told it to do. And it's because the buttons are just a little bit too sensitive. And this case is just, it's your typical case. So like this is doing normal stuff. But because it covers up the buttons and you have, you know, this TPU silicone surrounding the buttons, as you press one button, there is a little bit of force that's going to be applied to the other buttons, and they're insensitive, or they're sensitive enough that they take that as force, and you get accidental presses. Again, for the most part, just handling this device in normal life, I didn't really have a problem. If you're putting it in and out of a pocket often, you probably will run into it occasionally, but not a big deal. It's really when you pull this case into the equation that it becomes a problem. And that's kind of a bummer, because I actually thought this was a nice case otherwise. It's, you know, your standard TPU. But what I like about a case like this, especially on an audio player like this that has a glass back or just these metal rails, is that when I put this thing on a hard table, it's just, I don't like that sound of, you know, hard on hard. So I like having something like this little TPU case to soften that blow, make it a little bit easier to huck around. But unfortunately with this guy, I just can't use it with that case. Like, it's kind of an unusable product with this case, if I'm being perfectly honest. Okay. All right. But let's get into talking more about the good stuff, because we're going to talk about the I/O on this thing. So it does have your standard micro SD card slot. It's up here at the top. It's not covered behind a door. I think that's fine. And in fact, when you have the case on it, unlike most cases, there's actually an opening for it, which is, that's a nice attention to detail. I wish that they had openings for the buttons. All right, sorry, we're done with the case for now. But you've got your micro SD card slot up there. You've got your standard single-ended and balance connectors here on the bottom for your headphone jacks. So you do have a 4.4 mil balance and 3.5 mil single-ended. But one thing you might notice that's not down here on the bottom is a USB connector, because that's on the top with the micro SD card. And this is another one of those things. Oh, there you go. You saw me just accidentally trigger a button. Anyway, that's another one of these things that this player does that other companies don't do, that I wish more companies did. I think this is the ideal configuration. Connectors on the bottom, headphone connectors on the bottom, power cable on the top. Because if I want to, you know, if I'm bringing this thing into work, put it on a desk, Maybe you want to plug it into your computer, either to run as an external DAC or just to charge it. You can plug it in at the top, have that running off the top of your desk toward your computer or toward your power cords, and then have your headphone jacks running out toward you, like sitting behind it. And this is just, I think this is peak layout. More audio companies, I think, should be doing this kind of layout because it makes all the sense in the world. It's a little bit atypical. Obviously, other companies aren't doing it. It's maybe just a little unintuitive, but I really do think that this is the best configuration for an audio player that is likely to be plugged into a wall while you're listening to it or into a computer. Just really a really smart layout. Yeah, I dig that. So there's some more stuff that they're doing that other people aren't doing. But let's talk about more of the functionality of this device, the software experience and all that jazz. Like I mentioned up top, this thing is running Android. It is Android 13, which is a little bit newer of a version of Android than your average Android player. In fact, we can go in here into, actually, does this thing show the specs? Hold on, I forget. Sometimes, it doesn't show us that much. But yeah, it's got Android 13. I believe it's got 4 gigabytes of RAM, which is a little bit more than you get in some of these devices, but it is running your typical Snapdragon 665 processor, which is not a state-of-the-art processor, but when it comes to digital audio players, for me, Snapdragon 665 is a good balance of battery efficiency, as well as just giving you enough power to run things like Spotify without it just being a drag on the system. And this thing runs Spotify well. It should run all of your other softwares. In fact, this thing has the Google Play Store. I'll punch in on that so you can take a look. It's got the Google Play Store, so anything that you can think of on Android that you would want to download and install in this device, you should have no problem. I had no problems installing my typical modifications. I use, for example, Niagara Launcher. So I override the stock launcher to use Niagara, and it works well here. I also run Battery Bar Overlay, which gives me this little white battery bar over there that lets me see the battery life, even though PowerAmp is covering it up. It lets me install PowerAmp, which is my music player of choice, and it runs beautifully on this device. And then it also lets me run my music library syncing software, which is called Drive Sync. This just means that I can have my music on Google Drive and either with the press of a button or just automated jobs overnight, have this thing sync my music library automatically. I love that. So again, some people don't understand why you would want to have Android in an audio player. Those are reasons why, in my opinion. Syncing my music library and being able to run the PowerAmp interface, that is like, this is the best interface for portable music, in my opinion. And the iBasso DX180 does it quite well. The only issue that I really had with the Android experience on this device is it lacks a feature that I use a lot. And this might be kind of niche and maybe this doesn't matter to you, but let me give you my pitch. There is a feature that I use on these players called app pinning, okay? Basically what you do is you go into this view, and normally I would click up here and you get this little menu. Sorry, I'm at an odd angle and it's a small touch. You get this little menu and there's a button called pin screen or something like that. And I don't have it here on this device. And what that does is it will basically lock you into a specific app. For me, it's always PowerAmp, right? That's the app I want to lock myself into. And it means that when I turn the screen off and turn it back on, I don't have to type in my password, okay? It locks me into the screen. And if I want to use any other app, I have to press these 2 buttons to unpin the screen, and then I have to type in my password in order to use apps that might have sensitive information. Again, this thing is using my Google Drive account. It's got my Gmail ostensibly on it. Not that I'm using Gmail on this device, but it's got all that. It's got my Google account on this thing. And I know some people like to use burner Google accounts for this very reason, because you don't want to have to put a password on your audio player, but I've got this thing downloading softwares that I've purchased years ago. Like I wanted to have access to my Google Drive stuff, my Google Drive music, I needed to have access to. So for me, I think it's important if you have an audio player like this, you're taking it out of the house, you need to worry about the security, be concerned about the security, have a password on it. But having a password on it is kind of a pain in the butt with an audio player, because you're just going and changing your music and you have to type in your password when you need to do that. It becomes a bit of a deterrent. My solution to that is using app pinning so that I can lock myself into the music app and not have to type in the password and not give up any security. Unless access to my music library is a security issue, but it's not. I don't listen to the embarrassing stuff that you guys listen to. But unfortunately, this device doesn't support app pinning. I would say it's like actually kind of a significant issue for me. Again, the way I use an audio player. If you don't do any of that, I can understand that doesn't matter to you. For me, that's actually kind of a significant thing, but I can live with it. I can live with that. It just means that I end up typing in my password in this thing more often than I do on most other audio players. Okay. Anything else I want to talk about with the kind of operating system? I don't think so. So let's real quickly talk about this stock music app. So I mentioned I use PowerAmp. I have not really been using this stock music app because I don't really use the stock music apps on any phone or on any digital audio player. They're not as good as PowerAmp. PowerAmp is good. And I would say that the stock music apps that come on these devices range from kind of really bad to like not bad. Like the Hibi app is not bad. The File one is okay. The Mango app that iBasso includes, I would say is on the worst side of audio players. Yeah, it's a little rough. So even just like explaining how rough it is kind of hard because it doesn't make sense to me. You might think, for example, all right, here's your standard playback screen. I want to go back to my music library. So maybe I would tap this menu button, but this is now going to a list of all songs. Like it says all music. This is literally just a list of all of the songs that I have. Like this is not a view I ever use in my audio player experience. I understand it exists in other audio players. I just never use it. But with this guy, it's like the main button that you have, which I don't understand. And then instead to get to how I would normally navigate music, which is by artist, you have to swipe in here from the left. Where did it go? And now I can go to artist, right? Let's go to Alice in Chains, MTV Unplugged, fantastic album, by the way. And this is how I would typically browse my music, right? Listen to music, go back here. Okay. In fact, when I'm here at this point, going back to the menu button does take me back to where I expect. But if I hit back again, like it puts me in this weird loop where now this just goes back to all music again, which is just bewildering. The other thing that's notable is like this swipe gesture is like kind of easy to screw up. Maybe not so much on this screen, but on this screen, like I can swipe in from the left, but you saw there that the first swipe, if I swipe in the wrong place, and even there, I don't get this thing. It's a really weird UI. You can also swipe in from the right to get to some other options, including the option to enable the DAC mode. But again, it's like really easy to swipe the wrong area. You get wrong inputs. This is a bad interface, guys. I'm sorry. The good part is it's Android, right? I can install PowerAmp. I don't have to use this interface. So it's kind of a moot point, but it's nonetheless a little bit of a complaint for me. The other thing is, okay, well, let's dive into my usual complaints. Let's go to artist, and I want to listen to The Cure. We're going to go down to the C's, but The Cure is not available in the C's. The Cure is alphabetized under the Thes. Here's all my The albums, or The artists, which is not my preferred way to organize this. In fact, I don't know, why does it have one album by The Cure separate from that's my first time noticing that. That's weird. One thing that this does do that I like is it lets you play all songs from an artist in order, right? So it's starting with Disintegration album. It's starting with the first track of that album, and it's going to skip through from one album to the next. A lot of audio players don't give you that option. PowerAmp does, so it's a bit of a moot point for me on those other audio players. But if I'm getting into what's the thing that I do like about the Mango app, I like that, okay? But here's maybe my biggest problem with this app. You know, again, I can use, I don't even, what am I, I'm hitting buttons and it's just doing things I don't expect. Oh my gosh, dude, so Jeebus. The biggest frustration for me, because I could totally ignore this app and pretend it doesn't exist there, but it is actually required for a couple of things. One, in order to use this audio player as a USB DAC, you do have to actually go into this app, swipe in from the right, and then you can enable USB DAC mode. That's maybe a light issue. But the bigger issue for me is that this thing does have an equalizer. In fact, it's got a nice parametric equalizer. I would say the interface in this thing is not ideal, but it is nice that it's there at least. How do I even... What? Oh, there you go. Again, this interface is not great, but it does give you access to parametric EQ, so you can set the frequency. You can choose which kind of filter you want. In fact, there's a lot of filters in here I wasn't even like familiar with. Like a high pass filter, interesting. I don't recommend that, but low shelf, peaking filter, high shelf filters, all super useful. It means that you can really sculpt the music to sound exactly the way that you want. The only problem is that it's not a system-wide option. It's only limited to this Mango app. So if you want access to that parametric EQ, you're not going to be able to do it out of the box. You're going to have to provide your own equalizer software outside. Again, Power Amp does actually have an option. So Power Amp for the win again, but there we go. All right, anything else I want to complain about the software? I don't think so. Just looking at my notes about the EQ, small note is that even though it is parametric EQ, there's only 6 bands from what I can tell, which is usually enough to do what you want. But a lot of like squiggling, for example, will often output like a 10-band EQ profile, and 10 bands this thing won't accept. In fact, this thing doesn't have like an import-export function also. So any EQ profiles that you want to use in this device, you're gonna have to like punch them in manually. But there you go. All right. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of functionality on this device is the battery life, which is probably the biggest limit for me on this thing. All right. Most of the things that I've talked about in this device are very positive to exceptional, things that other audio players don't, to maybe some small nitpicks that I can get past, some software issues I can completely ignore because I'm using Power Amp. But one thing I can't get around is the battery life on this guy. And it's not bad, but it's kind of mediocre. It's about 15 hours of claimed battery life. And that about matches my listening impressions. So 15 hours for me is like enough to get through like a day and a half of listening. And that just means I end up having to charge this thing much more often than I like to. Yeah, I don't know, it's a little bit of a disappointment, especially because on their website, they list 2 different battery lives, which I was actually a little confused by. I think some people were too, because someone in the comments on the YouTube video told me something that actually ended up being incorrect. It's 15 hours of battery life listening to the headphone jacks, normal. They have 30 hours claimed battery life if you're listening to this thing in line out mode. And you can do line out, unbalanced, or the 3.5 mil. I did have the wise idea. I was like, oh, maybe I'll just listen to this thing in line out mode, because you still have access to volume control, which is interesting. But unfortunately, there is a pretty significant change in, I'm guessing, the output impedance of the device once you switch it over to line out mode. It made my Truthier hexas, for example, sound significantly brighter using line out mode, and it made my Truthier Zero Reds significantly bassier on line out mode, which that just suggests to me that it's probably got 20 to 50 ohms of output impedance, which is not uncommon for a line out mode. That's totally normal and expected. But if you're trying to be smart or clever like me, and use the line out mode as a workaround to the battery life, it's not going to work. You're going to be stuck with the 15 hours of claimed battery life, and that's pretty much matched my expectations. So a little bit disappointing. I would love to see at least 20 hours of battery life. That's when I will be happy. 30 hours of battery life for me is exceptional. If this thing had 30 hours of battery life, this would probably be my new daily driver DAP. But unfortunately, it doesn't have those things. Okay, let's talk about the sound briefly on this thing, and I won't delve into it too much. In terms of hardware, it does have 4 Cirrus Logic DACs built into it. It has pretty significant output power on this thing. So on single-ended, it's 280 milliwatts of output power, which is, I mean, that's going to be more than enough to drive something like Sennheiser HC600s. It's going to be enough to drive my Dan Clark Audio E3s. This thing will drive any headphone that I've got on single-ended, no problem at all. But if for some reason you need more power output, on balance, this thing has actually 690 milliwatts of output power, which in a $500 DAP is actually really, really stinking impressive. Again, it's way more than I need. I don't really care, I guess, but I'm nonetheless impressed. It's useful if you're going to like an audio show and it's going to be loud. You maybe need to listen louder than your normal listening, and you're using headphones that I'm using headphones that I'm not familiar with. This is a very particular use case. It maybe doesn't apply to most people, but for me, it is nice that it has that headroom, but not really that necessary, because again, I can drive Sennheiser HD600s to my normal listening volume with about 100 milliwatts of power. So now, apart from power output, noise floor is another thing that is a noticeable sound difference between audio players. And I think that the DX180 does a pretty good job with the noise floor. With my super sensitive Campfire Audio Auras, the noise floor in this guy is negligible. And that's true on both 3.5 millimeter and 4.4 millimeter. A lot of the times with these audio players, the more power you put into them, the more chance that you're gonna get like a hiss using sensitive IEMs. But the DX180 does a really good job with that. It is audible, I will say. There is an audible noise floor there, but it is super minimal, super ignorable. If you're listening to music, even on the most sensitive IEMs, you're probably not gonna notice it. And one thing that's kind of notable on this guy is that with most audio players that have both single-ended and balanced, almost always the balanced has like double the noise floor of the single-ended. But here in this case, that's not the case. The DX180's 4.4 is at least as quiet as the 3.5. And if anything, it actually seemed like the noise floor was even a little bit better attenuated on balanced than the standard 3.5, which is nice to see. The other thing that I will mention briefly is interferences. This is a thing that I don't normally encounter during listening, but some audio players can pick up interferences from things like the processor running really fast or the Wi-Fi radios running at max bandwidth. And here with the DX180, I am able to elicit a little bit of static noise if I've got this thing maxing out the Wi-Fi radio. If like I'm doing a speed test while listening to a track that's just silence, you can hear a little bit of staticky noise, but it's pretty mild, it's pretty ignorable. I mean, the real world scenario where you might encounter it is if you're listening to a quiet part in music, maybe even like a pause in the music, and you happen to be scrolling your Spotify like home screen, which is a pretty heavy home screen, to be honest. In that case, with a really sensitive IM on the DX180, you might be able to pick up a little bit of a staticky noise, but for the most part, I think it's just not going to be a concern. On the Aura, I could hear it a little bit, even just listening to something like the Truth Ear Hexa, which is a less sensitive IM, but not like a hard to drive IM or anything like that. Even with something like the Hexa, it was completely inaudible. So for the most part, that is just a negligible fact of this audio player, in my opinion. And that's going to lead us into my conclusion here on the iBasso DX180. A lot of things to like about this audio player, a couple of things to nitpick, and a couple of things to be, I guess, sincerely disappointed by. What I love, the replaceable battery. Nobody else is doing that. I wish more companies did that. It's got the USB connector on top. Again, I wish more companies did that. They're not doing it. And then it's got a beautiful build, which, okay, other companies do, but this might still be, I think, the most attractive audio player you can get for 500 bucks. What it's limited by is the battery life. I think it could be better. It's not bad, but it could be better. The lack of app pinning is a little bit of an inconvenience for me, might not matter for you. And I think this thing needs a better case because the buttons are just a little bit too sensitive. But overall, I don't know, I'm gonna give the iBasso DX180 4 stars out of 5. I think it's a very solid little player, does a lot of things quite right, and it almost became my de facto go-to player, if not for the battery life, which is fine, but it's not the best. But still, if you want to check it out, of course, I've got it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews. We now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get into the future.